Kagame is playing with fire. What if Museveni, Ruto, and Samia retaliate?
The religion of alcohol. I think even if people recruit others into it, alcohol is killing you, it's killing young people. Well, abakuru bo barashize. Yes, it has killed so many old ones like us. It will kill you before you realize your ambitions. If you have any, because you must have ambitions first of all. Then don't cut your life short.
Something unusual is happening in East Africa. Rwanda, under President Paul Kagame, has become increasingly willing to restrict products from neighboring countries. And every time another restriction appears, I keep coming back to one question. What happens if Rwanda's neighbors decide to retaliate? What happens if Uganda says, enough? What happens if Kenya responds? What happens if Tanzania decides that if Rwandan authorities can restrict Tanzanian products, Tanzania can also make life more difficult for Rwandan trade? Because when you look at the map, Rwanda has one major weakness that speeches, diplomacy, or political confidence cannot change. Rwanda is landlocked. It has no seaport. And that means Kagame may be playing a much more dangerous economic game than it appears. Why are the other presidents not retaliating? We need to ask why the other East African leaders have generally avoided turning individual trade disputes with Rwanda into an all-out trade war. Look at Rwanda's neighborhood. To the north is Uganda, led by President Yoweri Museveni. Beyond Uganda is Kenya, led by President William Ruto. To the east is Tanzania, led by President Samia Suluhu Hassan. These countries have their own interests and disagreements with Rwanda, but they also belong to the East African community. The entire idea of the EAC is regional integration, easier movement of goods, people, and capital, not endless retaliation at borders. So restraint makes sense. If Tanzania responds to every Rwandan restriction with another restriction, and Rwanda responds again, the dispute can escalate. The same is true for Uganda and Kenya. Businesses suffer. Truck drivers suffer. Consumers suffer. Prices rise. And eventually, an economic disagreement can become a political and diplomatic confrontation. That may explain part of the restraint we see. But there is another possibility. Perhaps Rwanda's neighbors understand something very important. They don't necessarily need to retaliate aggressively because geography already gives them enormous leverage. Rwanda cannot change its geography. Take a map of East Africa and look carefully at Rwanda. Rwanda has no direct access to the ocean. For international trade, two corridors are especially important. The northern corridor connects Rwanda through Uganda and Kenya to the port of Mombasa. The central corridor connects Rwanda through Tanzania to the port of Dar es Salaam. That means three of the countries Kagame risks antagonizing, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, sit directly on Rwanda's most important routes to the sea. This isn't political rhetoric. It is geography. And geography doesn't negotiate. The IMF has identified Rwanda's landlocked position, high transportation costs, and dependence on the Mombasa and Dar es Salaam corridors as structural weaknesses for the country's trade. So imagine a serious trade confrontation. If relations with Uganda deteriorate, Rwanda can shift more trade through Tanzania. We have already seen something similar before. During the Rwanda-Uganda border closure, Rwandan companies adjusted by finding alternative suppliers, particularly through Tanzania and the DRC. But there was still a cost. Now imagine something much bigger. What if Rwanda simultaneously develops serious trade disputes with Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya? Where does Kagame redirect the trucks? Where does the fuel come through? Where do imported construction materials enter? Where do industrial inputs travel? Where do Rwanda's exports go on their journey toward international markets? That is where the strategy becomes extremely risky. Kagame cannot win a three-front trade war. Let's be clear about something. Uganda would also lose money from a trade confrontation with Rwanda. Kenya would lose business. Tanzania would lose business. Nobody wins a trade war completely, but the pain would not necessarily be equal. Kenya has direct access to the Indian Ocean. Tanzania has direct access to the Indian Ocean. Uganda is itself landlocked, but it has a much larger domestic market than Rwanda and direct access through Kenya and Tanzania. Rwanda's position is considerably more vulnerable. The African Development Bank has estimated that transportation can account for roughly 40% of the total cost of Rwanda's imports and exports. That tells you how important regional cooperation is for Kigali. A small landlocked country can absolutely become prosperous. But to do that, it needs something extremely valuable: reliable relationships with its neighbors. That is why Rwanda benefits enormously from regional integration. And that is why picking simultaneous economic fights with several neighboring countries could become dangerous. What if Tanzania retaliates? Tanzania is particularly important. The port of Dar es Salaam and the Central Corridor provide Rwanda with one of its essential connections to international markets. Imagine that a trade dispute becomes increasingly hostile. Tanzania doesn't have to close the border completely to create problems. More inspections, more paperwork, longer clearance times, new regulatory requirements, additional restrictions. Any serious disruption along a major corridor can increase transportation costs and delays. And those additional costs don't remain at the border. Eventually, they reach consumers. A truck transporting goods costs more. The importer pays more. The wholesaler pays more. The shopkeeper pays more. And finally, an ordinary Rwandan family pays more. And what if Kenya and Uganda respond too? This is where the scenario becomes even more serious. Because Rwanda needs alternatives. If one corridor becomes difficult, another corridor gives Kigali flexibility. But what happens when relations become difficult with several neighbors simultaneously? Rwanda cannot move Mombasa. It cannot move Dar es Salaam. It cannot create an ocean next to Kigali. And airplanes cannot economically replace trucks and ships for the enormous quantities of fuel, food, machinery, construction materials, and other goods required by an entire economy. That is why Rwanda's geographic position requires careful diplomacy. Rwanda already has economic pressures. This potential confrontation would not happen in an economic vacuum. Rwanda has been experiencing significant inflationary pressure. The country continues to import large quantities of goods, including food, fuel, equipment, construction materials, and other products needed by consumers and businesses. At the same time, Rwanda has a persistent trade deficit. In simple language, Rwanda buys considerably from the outside world, while its export base remains relatively narrow. That creates pressure on foreign currency. Importers need dollars and other hard currencies to purchase goods abroad. So what happens if transportation becomes more expensive? What happens if imports become more difficult? What happens if regional trade declines? The pressure can move through the economy. And once again, the person who ultimately feels it may not be Kagame. It may be the ordinary Rwandan. The poor will pay the highest price. This is the part that concerns me most. When governments fight trade wars, presidents don't usually go hungry. Senior officials don't suddenly stop eating because food prices increased. But low-income families notice immediately. Imagine someone in rural Rwanda already struggling to feed a family. A small increase in transportation costs may look insignificant when discussed in government offices. But when transportation, fuel, or imported inputs become more expensive, those increases can eventually affect food prices and the prices of necessities. And for a family already spending most of its income to survive, even a relatively small increase matters. That is why this isn't just about Kagame versus Museveni. It isn't just Kagame versus Ruto. And it isn't Kagame versus Samia Suluhu Hassan. This is ultimately about millions of ordinary East Africans whose livelihoods depend on governments keeping trade moving. So why take the risk? That brings us back to the central question. Why would Kagame risk escalating trade tensions with countries Rwanda economically needs? Perhaps Kigali believes these governments will continue exercising restraint. Perhaps Rwanda believes EAC rules will prevent serious retaliation. Perhaps Kagame calculates that Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania benefit enough from Rwandan trade that they won't risk disrupting it. And perhaps he is right. But that is still a gamble. Because Rwanda's negotiating position changes dramatically if its neighbors decide that restraint is no longer working. A country can diversify suppliers. It can negotiate new trade agreements. It can build warehouses. It can improve domestic production. But Rwanda cannot manufacture a coastline. Its goods must cross somebody else's territory to reach the major ports of the Indian Ocean. That simple geographic reality should shape Rwanda's foreign and economic policy. This is why I believe Kagame needs to be extremely careful. The real question isn't whether Rwanda has the sovereign right to enforce standards or restrict products that don't meet its regulations. Of course it does. The real question is whether these decisions are being made transparently, consistently, and in accordance with East African community rules, or whether trade policy is increasingly becoming another instrument of political confrontation. Because if this becomes a genuine regional trade war, Rwanda has more to lose than Kagame may be willing to admit. Museveni has options. Ruto has options. Samia has options. Rwanda has options too, but geography gives Kigali fewer of them. And if Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania ever decide to respond collectively or simultaneously, the consequences could travel very quickly from the border to the trucks, to the businesses, to the markets, and finally to the tables of ordinary Rwandans. That is the danger. A trade war may begin between presidents, but ordinary people could end up paying the bill.